that's a great way to save a lot of time if you understand the concepts kind of intuitively and conceptually.
Alex back for another MCAT podcast. This week, after finishing up passage 8, sometimes you know, sometimes you don't. That when you click that next button, you're going to jump into a discrete set. Sometimes a different strategy needed for discretes versus passage, although the last passage that we saw had some discrete questions in it. What, again, mindset-wise, what do you discuss for getting to discretes in these sections?
Yeah, I think students often do much better on discretes, perhaps on average, than they do on passages, because they often kind of draw much more purely on content knowledge rather than interpretation. So I always advise students, I was like, look, the discretes are, for many people, some of the easiest points that you're going to get on this test. So, you hit that button, you move from a passage to a discrete, you take a sit, sit back for a few seconds, take a deep breath, because, that passage has just dropped off the edge of your universe again. Yeah, so I think because, discretes are in many sense some of the easiest points that you'll get on the test, easy in a relative sense. Of course, many of them are very difficult. But so I always say to you see a discrete, leave the previous passage behind. You've done your best. Address the discretes now with kind of the full force of your problem-solving abilities.
Alrighty, let's go ahead and jump into our discrete set again from Blueprint MCAT Full Length 1. We're here with question 44 from our Biochem section.
Woohoo!
I'll let you start.
A researcher analyzes a nucleic acid sample. After looking only at its nucleotide composition, he decisively concludes that this sample represents single-stranded DNA and not another form of nucleic acid. Which of the following compositions most likely represent this sample? And then we get we get a very long list of numbers. There's A is 17% A, 17% T, 33% G, and 33% C. For B, we have 29% A, 14% U, 11% G, and 46% C. C is 4% A, 4% U, 46% G, and 46% C. And finally, D is 12% A, 12% T, 30% G, and 46% C. It's a lot of numbers.
Oh, boy. So the thing right off the bat that kind of stood out to me was like, well, double-stranded, things are connected to each other. So you would expect to see relatively equal numbers of things if they're connected to each other, right? In terms of what bases connect to each other, right? A to T, G to C, I think.
Yeah. Yep.
And U in there as well, for A to U as well. Mm-hmm. God, I forget so much of this, but that kind of makes sense. And so you look at this and you go, okay, wait a minute. Answer choice A, you see 17% A, 17% T, 33% G, 33% C. So right off the bat, that's like they're connected to each other. There's equal amounts. That obviously is too uniform to be a single strand of just a random number of things. Am I on the right track?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, it probably could be single-stranded, but I think that would be extraordinarily unlikely.
Yes.
Roll the cosmic dice and you'd have this flawless strand of DNA with its base pairs in perfect proportion.
Yes. All right. So answer choice B, we see 29% A, 14% U, 11% G, 46% C. So you go, okay, that's not anywhere near uniform, so maybe that's what I'm looking for. So I'll leave that one struck through. Answer choice C, 4% A, 4% U, 46 G and C. So again, that's like super uniform. I'm gonna cross that one out as well. And then the last one here, answer choice D is 12% A, 12% T, 30% G, 46% C. And now I freak out and go, wait a minute, my theory that things should be equal is not playing out with answer choice D, because you have A and T, which are equal percentages, but G and C are not. And so then I go, well, why would G and C not be? And I really don't know, but I don't like that one because A and T are the same. So I'm going to go with B.
Yeah, I think that's a great job of eliminating based off uniformity, because you're totally right. Like, what are the chances that a single-stranded DNA would have like all of its base pairs in perfect proportion? Pretty unlikely.
Yeah.
I think the second kind of concept to bring in here is base pair composition, which is, DNA consists of 4 base pairs, A, T, C, and G. You said them yourself. But U is in reference to uracil, which is also a nitrogenous base. It looks very similar to T, thymine. But instead of being in DNA, U is only present in RNA.
Oh.
So in this case, we can eliminate both B and C based off the fact that they just have U in them. Because if it's, if this researcher like sees the results from this piece of DNA, or from this nucleotide, and they see that it contains U, it's like, oh, well, it's not DNA because DNA doesn't contain U.
Well, that's a silly mistake.
Yeah.
Yep.
So then that leaves us with D as the only option left. So yeah, I agree. Like 12% A, 12% T. This is definitely the test designers trying to throw us off. But 30% G, 46% C. Yep. In a single-stranded piece of DNA, those proportions must always be equal. The fact that they are not means that this must be single-stranded.
Yep. Alrighty, answer choice D for that one. Learned my mistake there. All right, question 45. In a population of Amish people, the frequency of the recessive autosomal allele for polydactyly is 1.2%. What percent of the population are heterozygotes for the polydactyly allele? Oh, man. All right, so what is allele or polydactyly?
Polydactyly.
Yes. So for those who don't know, polydactyly is having more than 5 digits. Autosomal recessive autosomal allele, the frequency of it is 1.2%. What percent of the population are heterozygotes for the polydactyly allele? Wow.
Right off the bat, are you tempted to eliminate any as implausible?
97.6.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, me too.
Answer choice D. So answer choice A is 0.0144%. Answer choice B is 1.19%. Answer choice C is 2.37. So answer choice A and D are both kind of extreme, high and low. Answer choice B and C are somewhat similar in terms of their excessiveness.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's something about there's something about B and C that make them seem approximately right, and something about A and D that it's like, no, these are like orders of magnitude off in either direction.
Yeah. So let me rephrase the question, which is always a strong thing to do here. What is it asking me? So the frequency of the autosomal allele, this recessive autosomal allele, is 1.2%. The frequency. So it's saying, hey, 1.2% of the population has this recessive autosomal allele. What percentage of the population are heterozygotes for the polydactyly allele? And then heterozygote means like you have at least one of them, right? You have the frequency of the recessive autosomal allele. Are they saying that is the population that's homozygous? Because it's almost like, hey, the population has this frequency. What is the frequency of it? I'm like, wait, it's just 1.2%.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we're asking for people who are heterozygous for the allele, that means presumably, people who carry one copy of the recessive allele and one copy of the dominant allele. I like this question a lot because it's a question that if, were I taking the test, so you can solve this with a bunch of math. You can the equation that we're looking for that describes this relationship between recessive and dominant allele frequencies and percentages of the population that have various genotypes is the Hardy-Weinberg equation. Were I approaching this, I'd be like, ooh, like Hardy-Weinberg equation, like hard work. Like I don't like doing math unless it's absolutely necessary. So I would look at this and say, well, the Hardy-Weinberg equation tells us that, and for those who don't remember, it's big A plus little a equals 1, or sometimes P plus Q equals 1, and then it's kind of counterpoint equation, which is A squared, or rather P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. Which is actually the same equation as the first equation. It's just what you get if you square both sides. And the individual terms in that second quadratic equation describe genotype frequencies in the population. But the general proportion to keep in mind, if you have a certain proportion of the population that is that has the dominant gene, and a certain proportion of population that has the recessive gene, and then the proportion of them that have both together that are heterozygous usually lies somewhere in between, because that term in that equation is 2PQ. So I would immediately look at this and say, oh, well, the frequency of the allele is 1.2%. That means presumably the people who have the dominant allele is 98 point something percent. I'd be like, well, that means I would assume that people who are heterozygous, presumably there are more of them than there are people who have 2 copies of the recessive gene. 1.19 is almost exactly the same as 1.2. So I would be tempted to pick C here, which is 2.37. This is how I would solve it with estimation, going off kind of an intuitive understanding of how the proportions work. And then that's a great way to save a lot of time if you understand the concepts kind of intuitively and conceptually. But of course, we can solve this with math as well.
So getting back to the question and what it's asking here.
Yeah.
When it says the frequency of the recessive autosomal allele is 1.2%, that's not saying that's how many people have polydactyly in a homozygous polydactyly, right?
No.
That's just saying that's how many people have at least one allele, this recessive polydactyly allele.
Yeah, I always conceptualize this as like, imagine like a big gene pool, imagine literally in this case, imagine it's like a giant pool and it's filled with gene copies and it's like represents the population as a whole. If you think of like an enormous group of people, it's like, oh, they all have alleles, they all have copies, and they all have 2 each. But if you think of like a big pool full of these genes, it's like, well, some percentage of them will be the dominant version, and some percentage of them will be the smaller version, or will be the recessive version. And if we look in the population, that's what that first equation describes: P plus Q equals 1. Yep. This isn't in reference to people's genotypes; it's in reference to the proportion of genes in the population as a whole.
Okay.
Of all alleles in a population where everyone has 2, in this case, 1.2% of them are the recessive version.
Got it.
And that's all. And that's why if we go to that equation which describes genotypes, P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. That's always why, the Q squared, for example, term describes people who are homozygous recessive.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happens. And you get that in an ideal Hardy-Weinberg population by multiplying the frequency of the recessive allele by itself. And that makes intuitive sense, because you would expect that, if 1% or 1.2% of all genes in this population are are the recessive genes, well, then presumably an even smaller percentage of those people will be lucky enough to get 2 of them.
So there you go. Answer choice C, 2.37%. Again, even going back to that one, answer choice A and D being the extreme outliers, very good test strategy. If you don't remember any equation or anything else, you narrow down to 50%.
Always so, key skill, eliminate implausible answers.
All right. Am I up? I'll read this one. Question 46. Those species that are capable of both sexual and asexual reproduction will typically prefer sexual reproduction because it, A, increases the likelihood of each individual offspring surviving, B, increases the likelihood of beneficial mutations, C, creates more variation in the next generation, or D, takes less time to complete. So I think just from an evolutionary standpoint, this is a relatively easy question that we as a species tend to prefer more variation in our offspring. I for one don't want someone exactly like me as a child. I do not wish that upon the world. I see myself in my kids and it freaks me out. I'm like, no, don't have that trait of me. So I think C, creates more variation in the next generation, would be evolutionarily the right answer, I think.
Yep, that's exactly right. Yeah, so sexual reproduction is a really valuable mechanism by which species can kind of I always think of it as like shuffling your genetic deck of cards. Mm-hmm. You combine the genes of 2 parents and use that to create more variation in the next generation. This variation is incredibly helpful because it creates a more interesting gene spread in the population, which allows them to better adapt to kind of new and interesting situations. Lots of the other answer choices here kind of they rely on misunderstandings of how evolution itself kind of works. So, if we look at A, increase the likelihood of each individual offspring surviving, in a lot of cases, that's actually not necessarily true. Certainly, sexual reproduction is good for the whole species because it improves variation across the entire species. But, often sexual reproduction leads to, unfavorable genes being expressed in the next generation when, perhaps by definition they weren't, or, they necessarily weren't expressed in the parent generation just because that parent generation made it to adulthood. Increases the likelihood of beneficial mutations. B, that's not how sexual reproduction works. That's separate from the process of mutations, which is kind of species specific, but is not inherently linked to the concept of sexual reproduction. And D, takes less time to complete. I mean, I'm sure any parent can weigh in, that's probably not true.
Yeah, but a lot of people who aren't sure, like, wait a minute, and they'll spend a lot of time going, did I learn that in biology? Like, if asexual reproduction, does it happen faster? And if it is faster, is that beneficial? Is that something important? And that's where they'll get hung up. Cool. An easy one. Yay, I think. Question 47, go ahead.
Decreased number of alveoli in the lungs leads to respiratory distress because A, damage to the respiratory epithelium reduces the ability of the epithelial cells to actively transport O2 into the body and CO2 out of the body. B, reduced surface area in the lungs reduces the rate at which O2 and CO2 can diffuse through the lung epithelium. C, passive expiration depends on the inherent elasticity in the walls of the alveoli, and reduced expiratory volume prevents or reduces subsequent inspiration. And D, the cilia lining the lungs, which move mucus and other debris out of the lungs and keep respiratory epithelium clear, cannot function as well.
So this is one of those tricky questions where the answer potentially, some of these answer choices are potentially correct, but don't answer the question. So
exactly,
this is a very standard. I see it a lot on the blueprint tests. I'm assuming it's very standard on the MCAT as well. That they're kind of red herrings. They're like, yes, that's true, but it doesn't answer the question. So
exactly.
decreased number of alveoli in the lungs leads to respiratory distress, right? So the first question is, well, what the heck do the alveoli do, right? And those are the little air sacs at the very end that increase the surface area, because you got lots of tiny little pouches and you have lots of surface area in each of those little pockets. And that's where a lot of this O2 exchange can come from. And so as soon as I say, well, what's the kind of role of alveoli? It's like, well, it helps increase the surface area. Then we have B, reduced surface area in the lungs reduces the rate at which O2 and CO2 can diffuse through the lung epithelium. And so you have decreased number of alveoli, you're going to have reduced surface area. So B immediately stood out to me. Again, A makes sense, but we're talking about decreased number of alveoli, not damage to the respiratory epithelium. So I don't like that answer. Answer choice C, passive expiration. I'm like, wait a minute, that's not what we're talking about here. And then D, again, cilia, we're not talking about alveoli. So I like all the other answer choices because some of it makes sense, but answer choice B seems to me to answer the question most directly.
And you would be correct in thinking so. Yeah.
I should have been a pulmonologist.
I agree. I totally agree. I would eliminate A and D immediately for the reasons that you said, which is like, wait a minute, like damage to the, like, we're not talking about damage, we're just talking about decreased numbers. And same thing with D, like, we're not talking about cilia, we're talking about alveoli.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would eliminate those immediately as being out of scope. D happens to be a true statement in the sense that if the cilia are damaged, then they can't move debris out of the lungs. But again, that's not what the question stem's concerned with. A is also wrong because epithelial cells don't actively transport O2 into the body and CO2 out of the body.
Yep.
The process is entirely passive. So we're left with B and C, which I think was like the tempting answers to pick between. And we can eliminate C because it's wrong, but for quite subtle reasons. Passive expiration is concerned. It does happen because of elastic recoil, but it's not the elasticity in the walls of the alveoli. The walls of the alveoli consist of just a single layer of epithelium. It's a monolayer of cells practically. It's very, very thin and therefore has almost no elastic recoil. Yeah. The elastic recoil that does provide the kind of impetus for expiration actually comes from the walls of the chest and the diaphragm itself. B here is the right answer. Reduced surface area in the lungs, which is exactly what you would expect from decreased numbers of alveoli because you have less exchanging space. Reduces the rate at which O2 and CO2 can diffuse through the lung epithelium because they do diffuse passively, they're not actively transported.